Next up, we have, again, speaking to the amendment, Mr. Blaikie. Go ahead, Mr. Blaikie.
Thank you very much. So I do want to add what I hope is a new contribution to the debate in a moment. I mean, we've heard that that what's at issue is not just a victimless crime. It's why the OECD anti-bribery unit has taken an interest in this, which I think is a serious taint on Canada's reputation and one that we'd like to see corrected as quickly as possible. I think we've heard many arguments over the last number of weeks, and including here today, about the importance of the rule of law and what it means to live in a country where top political leaders feel free to interfere in decisions that ought to be independent when we talk about criminal prosecutions. I think it's something that Canadians don't want to see happening in their own country, and there's serious concern about the allegations that it has, that kind of inappropriate political pressure has been put. I think, simply asking that, nothing criminal have gone on in that regard is far too low a bar for Canada. I think Canadians expect, and the Prime Minister highlighted in his mandate letters at the beginning of this Parliament and subsequently that the standard of ethics for his government and for his ministers would go beyond simply meeting legal requirements for ethics, but that ethics to him, he said, meant going above and beyond those requirements and not only not having done anything wrong, but to be seen to be not to have done anything wrong. And all of this reinforces the anxiety that I think a lot of Canadians feel, that there's one set of rules for wealthy and well-connected folks here in Canada and another set of rules for everyone else. There's certainly enough to feel like that may be happening, and I think until we get to the bottom of what's happening, Canadians are going to continue to lack confidence that that's the system they have and that it's working properly for them. So, I mean, as my colleague said earlier, it's why we think that the gold standard for restoring confidence on this is a public inquiry, not just to ensure that we can hear from everybody. So not just the people who are mentioned in today's motion. And I'd say that today's motion is really just a minimum in terms of who the committee can call. It just says for certain we should be sure to call these people. But of course, if the committee wants to call people beyond what's mentioned in the scope of the motion, the committee has every right to do that. And we certainly have some further suggestions about who we might hear from. But it's important that we launch the study and then we can have those discussions about who else would be appropriate to include. So there's that question in terms of having that led by someone independent. But the other thing that a public inquiry would do would be to provide some findings, presumably, which was not something that we got out of the Justice Committee hearings so far, that would give Canadians some idea as to what are the salient facts and how to interpret those and what should be the takeaway from what we've learned through all this testimony. The Justice Committee process, such as it was obviously inadequate. As I say, it didn't produce any findings, at least not as of yet, although it ought to have. There were clearly more people to hear from that we didn't hear from. And so, we're in an attempt to try and make sure that those other things that need to be heard get heard. And we've heard, I won't re-quote, but we've heard from Ms. Philpott that there's more to the story that needs to be told and that she feels she has something important to contribute. We've heard from Ms. Jody Wilson-Raybould that there's more to the story that needs to be told that she would like to tell. And and there's two reasons why they're not able to do that. One is having an appropriate forum, and the second, and ultimately the most important, is being released by the Prime Minister and Cabinet from Cabinet confidence so that they can say what it is that they have to say without fear of reprisal. And there are some arguments out there that I want to just take a moment to address, saying that they're already in a position to do so, which I don't believe is the case, not in any real or meaningful way. And those arguments, particularly in recent days, have had to do with parliamentary privilege and the nation and a cabinet oath. So the first thing I think that needs to be said about this that we haven't heard enough in that discussion, and I would query my Liberal colleagues on, is just to say that, I mean, do we really want it to be the case that the only reason we think people who have served in cabinet would keep their oath of secrecy is on pain of being fired from cabinet? And so if they're already out of cabinet, then what's the point? Why would they bother? Surely we have to think that there's a higher threshold for keeping the secrets of Canadian cabinet than that you might get kicked out. That means that anybody who's no longer in the cabinet who has served in cabinet, if we're to believe the Liberal line on this, could get up at any time in the House, and Liberals would have no problems with this, divulging cabinet secrets or details of what's happened at the cabinet table. We have other former members of cabinet who are still MPs and who could exercise parliamentary privilege. I'm surprised, although it seems to be an implication of the Liberal argument, that they can and could get up, no problem, any time in the House and start talking about details of cabinet meetings and other important issues that have come before the cabinet table. I think that's incoherent, and it certainly doesn't meet the kind of standard that I think Canadians expect of their government. And the reason why people want to hear from Ms. Wilson-Raybould and from Ms. Philpott isn't because it's just because it's juicy to get information about what happened in a cabinet, and it doesn't matter what the details are. The reason why people want to hear from these particular former ministers is because we're concerned that the Prime Minister's office was inappropriately interfering in what should be an independent judicial system. And we're concerned not just because we're concerned, although we are, but we're concerned also because organizations like the OECD Anti-Bribery Unit have said that they are concerned. Mm-hmm. And so we want to clear Canada's reputation, and we want to get to the bottom of what's happening. So this isn't just any circumstance of something that happened under the rubric of cabinet confidentiality that these women are being asked to talk about. And it doesn't make sense to say that, oh, well, because they have parliamentary privilege, anyone who has cabinet secrets could just get up in the House at any time. I don't think that that's a credible argument, and I think we should all be giving more respect to the oath of cabinet. So that's why it was important to get a waiver in the first place. That was something that the Prime Minister seemed to recognize when he issued a waiver to Ms. Jody Wilson-Raybould in the first place. He might have been thinking of the Treasury Board directives on cabinet confidence, which stayed in Section 5, and I'll just quote because I think this is important for members, particularly Liberal members who are out talking in the media about this, to know that these guidelines state there is no discretionary power provided to an individual minister or government institution to make a cabinet confidence accessible to the public. That's pretty clear. And that's a government document. That's not me making that up or coming up with that. That's a document that lays out the expectations around cabinet confidence. That's something that the Prime Minister seemed to understand when he issued a waiver in the first place. The only problem with that waiver was that it didn't extend for the full period in question. It stopped when Jody Wilson-Raybould was fired from the position of Attorney General and doesn't permit her to speak about the things that happened between then and when she resigned from cabinet. Now, it's perfectly plausible. Anybody who's ever had somebody in their life who was behaving in a way that you thought was erratic or strange and then discovered a detail that helped make sense of that behavior in hindsight will understand that it's perfectly plausible that something happened after she was fired from the post of Attorney General that made her go, that wasn't all a coincidence. That wasn't just a mishmash of meetings with different people who were concerned, but actually that was something quite deliberate and there was more to it. And she's hinted that there is something more to tell. I think Canadians deserve to be able to hear what that is. And if the Prime Minister doesn't feel that that something is incriminating and that he did nothing wrong, I don't understand. And if he's of the view that she could have said it under privilege at any time, well, it raises the question, why did you issue a waiver in the first place? The waiver, incidentally, which is confined not just in terms of the period of time, but also specifically to the Justice Committee hearings. Why issue that waiver in the first place? Why wasn't the position in the first place that she could share whatever she wanted to share under the rubric of parliamentary privilege? And it seems to me that the only credible answer I can come up with for that, is that the Prime Minister was concerned to limit her ability to speak only to the Justice Committee study, which we found was then summarily cut short by Liberal members on that committee, and that he was concerned that she only be able to talk about a particular point in time. So now, outside of that study and outside speaking about only that period of time that the Prime Minister wants her to be able to speak about, the risk is on her. And it's a risk that she will face legal proceedings. And it may be that ultimately a court will decide that parliamentary privilege trumps, but that's only after potentially it gets dragged through the courts for a long time. That's only after there are potentially other career implications, even outside of politics. We've heard a former law clerk who said it's unlikely she would be prosecuted for breach of trust and other things. but not that it's impossible. And we all know that court cases come with real costs, financial and otherwise. And even if you're vindicated in the end, by the time you get to the end of that process, it can be cold comfort that you were ultimately right. And all of this is happening, and the reason why she would have to take that risk if she spoke under parliamentary privilege is only because the Prime Minister refuses to give her permission to just tell her story. If the Prime Minister gives that permission, all of these debates go away. She could be released to go talk about this at a press conference, not just within the confines of a parliamentary committee, or having to awkwardly find time in the House when we all know no member can get up and speak about anything that they want at any time, subject to no conditions. And we haven't seen an effort from the government to work with the other parties to try and set aside that time. Where there was a space created at the Justice Committee, that was closed down. We're going to find out later today whether or not this becomes a space for that testimony to take place. And there hasn't been the kind of cooperation that you would expect. To make it easier to create that space at this committee, again, only because the government, and particularly the Prime Minister, by order in council, isn't making it easy by extending the waiver, we're trying to create that space. And our amendment today is about making it easier for our Liberal colleagues to create that space. Our amendment takes out some of the more politicized language in Clause A of this motion. The motion, if this amendment passes, would no longer refer to corruption. It defines clearly and relates clearly to the mandate of this very committee to take away all doubt that there is an appropriate way of tackling this issue at this committee that bears upon the proper work of this committee. And that's why we refer to the particular standing order. And the other thing that this amendment does that isn't so much for our Liberal colleagues, the first part is, the second part is for Canadians who want to understand the decision making on these files and want to understand why they're getting to hear or not getting to hear the full story. And that's having a public vote. Because when the Justice Committee process was shut down, that was done in private. Canadians didn't really get to hear the reasons why. They heard the reasons why that Liberals gave afterwards in the press conference, but they didn't get to hear the discussion. This is a discussion we're perfectly comfortable having in public. We think it's a discussion Canadians deserve to hear. They deserve to hear the reasons why, the real reasons why Liberals have voted against this motion. It's why I hope we don't proceed to a vote without hearing from any Liberals today. I think it would be a shame if they didn't put anything on the record that indicated why they're voting one way or another. That would be a shameful spectacle, to walk out of here and have no indication as to, on the record as to why it is that they would vote against this motion. And so all we're asking for is for that vote in public, and I hope we're going to hear from one of them before we have that vote so that Canadians can understand, if this doesn't go ahead, why it's not going ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blaikie. Next up, thank you, Mr. Kent. We'll go next to Mr. Blaikie again.
Thank you very much. So I guess the first thing I'd like to say in response to Mr. Erskine-Smith is that I don't accept that he speaks for his colleagues on the committee here. I mean, I take the argument from him, and of course the NDP would prefer to have a public inquiry. So if the argument is that he would prefer we have a public inquiry as opposed to what's being proposed today, we're happy to accept that any day of the week. Our impression is that that's not on offer, at least not so far. My question for all the other Liberals on the committee who voted against having a public inquiry is why they would be voting against this motion. And I'm not satisfied from Mr. Erskine-Smith's answer, which is particular to him, that we have the reasons why they will be voting against this motion. And I think Canadians deserve to hear why Liberals who are not supportive of a public inquiry are also not supportive of creating other forums for Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Ms. Philpott to come forward. We don't yet have that. We should have that before the vote. I invite all five of them to give their own reasons, as Mr. Erskine-Smith has done. I also would just like to say that I take it from the position that because the waiver doesn't extend to this committee, if we take that as a reason not to invite the Prime Minister, as this motion does, and as Mr. Kent has pointed out, that this motion does invite the Prime Minister to extend the waiver, that the Prime Minister would refuse to cooperate with an independent committee of Parliament. It's from the Prime Minister himself and from his House Leader. Often in the House we have heard that they respect the work of parliamentary committees, and I think if a parliamentary committee therefore said that they thought it was appropriate to study this issue and they wanted to hear from these witnesses, that the Prime Minister should have no problem in extending the waiver, as he did somewhat for the Justice Committee. So I mean, I also just don't accept that as an argument. I think it's important that this committee express its desire to get to the bottom of this issue, and that it make a request, as this motion would, of the Prime Minister to extend that waiver. So that's part of what we're doing here today. We're not just trying to launch a study at the Ethics Committee. We're also trying to call on the Prime Minister to extend that waiver out of fairness for Ms. Wilson-Raybould and for Ms. Philpott, who want to be able to tell their story. That's part of what we're doing here today as well. And so I think that's an important point that ought not to get lost. And I would hate to think that, you know, all of this talk about respecting the work of committees and wanting to allow them to do the work that they see fit was disingenuous in the House. And I take that by implication that that's the position of the Liberals on the committee, if they think that somehow if we call for this study and ask for the extension of the waiver, that the Prime Minister wouldn't grant it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blaikie. I have two other speakers still wishing to speak. The vote and the amendment for the vote for the amendment has been called. Do you still want to speak to the amendment? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Blaikie.
Partly, I'd just like to address some of what's been said in conversation, particularly the idea that we ought to wait on an appearance by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner in order to undertake a study. There's a couple of issues with that. One is that we know it's been made public that the Commissioner himself is sick and on an indeterminate leave, and so we don't know that, even though our parliamentary process around the estimates will continue, the Commissioner himself may very likely not appear. Even if he did, if the investigation were still underway, I'm quite sure that it's not his usual practice to comment on investigations that are actually happening. So until he concludes his investigation, there would be nothing for him to say at this in this place. And further, with respect to that investigation concluding, you know, without him back in his position, the Conflict of Interest Act, under which he reports in Section 44(7), says that the Commissioner shall provide the Prime Minister with a report setting out the facts, etc. In other words, the Act says that only the Commissioner provides that report. It's not clear that without an interim Commissioner, and there has been no interim Commissioner appointed, that report could actually be issued and therefore the investigation concluded. So absent having an actual interim Commissioner, I don't think it makes sense for the committee to wait on the Ethics Commissioner's appearance before the committee, because we really have no idea when that would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blaikie. Last before the vote, I believe.